Welcome to Alter Show. Today we're going to learn about augmented and virtual reality. We're going to learn about the first half of augmented and virtual reality. In a future video, we'll cover the second half of things. And the halves are split between hardware and use cases. Now, it makes sense to talk about AR and VR, or augmented and virtual reality, in terms of hardware and use cases, because the only reason to want this technology is specifically for use cases, right? That's sort of what you do with it. But the use cases are enabled by and also restricted by the hardware. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about the hardware. So we're going to dive right in and let's get to it. Now, augmented versus virtual reality. They're two words. They're often talked about together. They're often confused. What do they mean? Well, the first thing to bear in mind is that there's a decent reason why they're getting confused, and that is because they fall on the same spectrum of spatial computing. They are both about making a real human being feel present in a digital world in various ways. Now, before we actually talk about the distinctions between them, I want to comment real quickly on this thing called mixed reality, which you may have heard of. Mixed reality is a subset of augmented reality, but we're not going to talk about MR anymore because it just gets confusing. And with that, let's get started. Let's dive right into VR. So this right here is a virtual reality headset, or a generic virtual reality headset. This one doesn't actually exist. It just says VR on the front. Now, some things to note about the VR headset is that, first of all, they are goggles and that you can't see through them. So there's a human head that sits right in here, and their eyes are kind of peeking back behind here, if you can see it. And they can't see through. They are looking at a screen inside of here, and that is all they see. Now, what you'll also note about this VR headset, or some VR headsets, is that they are tethered. They need to be actually hooked up to a computer. These are two examples, which I'll talk about in a second. They require to be plugged into this computer, although this computer probably isn't powerful enough to actually do it. Some VR headsets have haptics, which means it's sort of giving you a sense of touch. We're not going to dive into that too deeply. And some VR headsets have 6 degrees of freedom tracking. This is actually a really important one. The degrees of freedom refer to how much of your movement the VR headset can replicate. So all VR has rotational tracking. That means when you turn your head, so for example, if I were to go here and turn it, what you would see in the world would actually reflect your head turning. But only some headsets have positional tracking. Some headsets will change the world as the headset moves, but others won't. So you could actually walk forward but stay in the same place inside of the virtual environment. 6 DoF, as it's called, is a lot better than 3 DoF for a number of reasons. And just to note, the lower end VR headsets tend to only be rotational. I actually did this incorrectly. This should be over here. And the high end headsets are 6 DoF in that they have both position and rotational tracking. So given this, let's talk about some actual VR headsets. On the lowest end is something called Google Cardboard. So Google Cardboard is a literal piece of cardboard that you stick your phone into. You'd kind of put it right in here. Your face would go here. Your phone inserts into this slot. And it's only 15 to 30 bucks, and it gives people a taste of what VR is. There are millions of them out there. Hundreds of thousands, if not millions, have been given away for free. I personally have 5 right now that I've been given for free. And it's really cool. It introduced a lot of people to the concept. But they are not a high-fidelity VR experience. These two, however, are. So these headsets, which are on the higher end and cost in the upper hundreds of dollars, are probably 2 of the leaders of VR right now. One is the HTC Vive, and one is the Oculus Rift. Oculus is a company owned by Facebook. Now, the Vive essentially goes like this. So you put it on your head, you look into it, you can't see outside of it. It's got a strap on the back. There's actually an audio strap that was recently released that would sort of make this look a little bit different. It has some divots on the front, which enable that 6 DoF tracking I was talking about. The Vive requires a computer in order to work. So when I'm using it, I plug it into my computer. The Rift is similar in that it has 6 degrees of freedom tracking, except the Rift has a slightly different mechanism, which I'm not going to get into right now, and it's also tethered to the computer. And so these 2 headsets probably provide the highest quality VR experience to date. So that's VR. Let's chat about AR. First, the big question, what is the difference between VR and AR? And before I tell you outright, let's take a look at these headsets for a second. Here's one. Here's another. Here's a third. All right, I'm going to give it away. They're glasses. They're not goggles. That's the critical thing about augmented reality. It is see-through. You put it on your head, but you can still see and interact with everything in your real world, including people. Now, one of the other critical features about AR is this thing called spatial mapping, which means the computer needs to understand the space around you so it can put, for example, a virtual object on the real table. Now, the headset that probably does this the best right now is the Microsoft HoloLens. It has really phenomenal spatial tracking. It doesn't even have to plug into the computer, although it is really expensive. Two other headsets of note are the ODG glasses and also the Meta 2. All three of these are really, really compelling experiences. They have a long way to go, but they really do show off what AR can be. Now, one other thing to note about AR is this thing called field of view. Field of view basically means how much can you see, how wide is the screen relative to your eyes. Now, for normal, unconstrained vision, humans can see roughly 200, 210 degrees. So right now, if I were to match this, it would kind of look like this. With VR, you get somewhere in the ballpark of 100 degrees, so somewhere like this. AR, though, is a lot more constrained right now. Depending on the headset, it can be more like this, maybe a little bit wider. So that is one of the big challenges of AR, is actually making the field of view larger. And the reason that's important is because suppose you are in the real world, right? So I'm standing here. If this is the bounding box on what I can see, even if there's like a real table sitting back here, and there's a virtual, let's call it rocket on this real table, as soon as I move out of here, I'm not actually going to be able to see this anymore. So we're just going to cover it up to pretend it's not there. So that's the big problem with the field of view. Once virtual objects go out of the field of view, they just don't show up anymore. So that was a little overview of AR. AR, like VR, has a long way to go, probably a little longer actually, although a lot of people think that AR is going to be possibly one of the more impactful technologies. Now, we're going to hop way back out here. So we were just inside of this hardware bubble talking about the hardware. And given the hardware, we can start to talk about use cases. I'm not going to dive in too deeply to these use cases just yet, but I want to do a sort of a quick overview, and the next video we upload will sort of dive a little bit deeper. There are a number of different use cases which overlap and are related in various ways. So kind of starting at one end, storytelling is one big area where people are putting a lot of work. Gaming is another. Social VR, so multiple people in the same VR environment, is a third. And then there's kind of this whole chunk of more productivity or even creativity-oriented use cases. So you have collaboration, sort of business collaboration. You've got education and training. You've got engineering and architecture. So for example, viewing architectural models in VR. And finally, there's art. If you're looking for something cool to do after watching this video, Google tilt brush or tilt brush videos, and you will spend a long time looking at incredible VR art. And one quick note before we end for today is that I want to talk a little bit about what Alter does. So Alter builds tools, productivity tools that augment intelligence. They sort of extend your cognition. And we like to think about them as being very related to a wide array of different use cases of AR and VR. I'll dive into that more next time, but it's just a sort of brief and incomplete overview. Intelligence augmentation covers education and training. It involves collaboration or is employed collaboratively. It can be artistic. It pertains to things you might work on as an engineer or as an architect. And what's more, you can think about some of the tools for intelligence augmentation in terms of stories or how things change over time in a meaningful way. And with that, I'm going to leave it for now. Hopefully you enjoyed that. If you have any questions, please feel free to shoot us an email at info@altervirtual.com. That's ALTARVIRTUAL.com. If you'd like to see us make a show for you, one of these environments, please feel free to reach out. We would love to. And with that, I'll see you soon. Take care.